Well, I should perhaps begin by explaining my title. I'm going to talk about sort of Wiltshireness, if that's a word. Hence the allusion to the moon. Wiltshire people are moonrakers, and we'll come back to that. But the ox and the sheep, that goes back to a clergyman in the 17th century, Thomas Fuller. He's on the left of your screen now, whose book, The Worthies of England, was published just after his death it was published in 1662. And this is how he began his description of Wiltshire. A pleasant county, he said, and of great variety. I have heard a wise man say that an ox left to himself would, of all England, choose to live in the north, a sheep in the south part hereof, and a man in the middle betwixt both, as partaking of the pleasure of the plain and the wealth of the deep country. Well, Wiltshire's north-south divide, of course, is actually northwest-southeast, with the Karelian Ridge running up diagonally. And the Karelian Ridge is the geology map here. If you can see G11, which is sort of dark green with spots, yeah? Or find Bremhill, the black square, and you'll see it goes either side of that. Runs up diagonally from Westbury through Bowood and Bremhill to Lynham and Highworth, and that's the dividing line, really. So that follows then that you in Bremhill, according to the wise man that Fuller quotes, have chosen to live in one of the best places in England, in the whole of England. You see, you're partaking of the pleasure of Wick Hill and Charlecote, and the wealth of Titherton, Lucas and Foxham. So just remember that. So Wiltshire, and indeed Bremhill, should have something of a split personality, and it's often expressed in the shorthand as chalk and cheese. And so much so that many people think that the expression originated in Wiltshire and specifically was coined by John Aubrey, who I think is now lurking behind everybody's pictures on the bottom right-hand corner. But you know what he looks like. That's not the case. It goes back, chalk and cheese thing goes back at least to 1393, 3 centuries earlier than Aubrey, when a medieval theologian, John Gower, described an unscrupulous shopkeeper selling chalk under the pretense that it was cheese. But it's certainly true that Aubrey had something to say on the subject, and particularly in the light of what Louise has just told us, his remarks, which are often quoted, seem quite apt. This is what he says, and I'm sure you've heard this before. In North Wiltshire, so Bremhill and all points to the left, as it were, the indigeni or aborigines speak drawling. They're phlegmatic, skins pale and livid, slow and dull, heavy of spirit. Hereabout is but little tillage, sort of arable farming, or hard labour. They only milk the cows and make cheese. They feed chiefly on milk meats, dairy products, which cools their brains too much and hurts their inventions. These circumstances make them melancholy, contemplative, and malicious. On the downs, the other side, the south part, where it is all upon tillage, arable farming, and where the shepherds labour hard, they've not leisure to read and contemplate of religion, but they go to bed betimes to their rest, to rise the next morning to their labour. And I suppose that's Aubrey's verdict, which I say is you've probably come across before. There's a bit more than that. You on the Claylands are apt to be fanatics, he says, by which he means nonconformists. Aubrey's verdict could also be summed up, I suppose, just by altering one word in that sort of pithy couplet: Wiltshire born and Wiltshire bred, strong in the arm and thick in the head. If you change it to or thick in the head, so you've got the south and the north. Well, I've emphasised some differences. We'll return to the differences shortly, but first, what holds Wiltshire people together? We're proud to be called moonrakers, but beware of this. There are imposters. So listen to this quote from a website. So now, on a cold February evening, the village gathers by the canal. Music is played and songs are sung, and a giant lantern moon is floated along the canal on a raft. Women with rakes attempt to pull it onto the bank, comic gnomes with long beards succeed in landing the moon by using a crane. Once lifted out, the gnomes carry it around the village, accompanied by a procession of locals carrying their own candlelit lanterns. Unfamiliar? Well, that describes a festival held on alternate years in a village near Huddersfield in West Yorkshire, which used to claim on its website that moonraking originated there and then migrated to Wiltshire. Well, the website doesn't say that now, after I was interviewed on a local radio station and put them straight. Their claim is easily disproved. The canal through, and the village, we would call the village Slaithwaite, in Yorkshire, they actually call it Slowit or Slowit or something like that. But that village, the canal through the village opened in 1811. There's a mention in print of Wiltshire moonrakers in 1787, and there's a published letter in 1791 from someone who claimed that his grandmother had used the term. So I think we can trace it back perhaps to the 1760s. The usual version of the story, clever locals outwitting a taxman while smuggling brandy, cannot then have been more than a century old, because excisemen and smuggling only became rife after about 1660. But that notion of the moon reflected in water appearing like a cheese, and of simpletons or a fox trying to fish it out, well, that goes back a long way, and it's found in many places, including Talmudic Jewish culture, the French medieval writer Rabelais, Irish folklore, and les pescaloons, wonderful word, the moon fishers, les pescaloons, of Aurillac in the Auvergne. In Wiltshire, the Moonraking Association took hold after the dialect poet Edward Slowe popularised it in a long piece of doggerel verse, which was first published in 1881. There's Edward Slowe on the right, reading his poem. So there's a kind of solidarity about Wiltshireness. We're all proud moonrakers, but there's also a dichotomy, chalk and cheese, ox and sheep, strong or thick. Well, I think it's time to move on to look at the origins. I'm going to bring it back to Bremhill in a minute, how Wiltshire came into being and how its boundaries have been drawn and redrawn. We have to begin long before the 19th century, because two of the units of government still valid were by then the best part of a millennium old. The shiring of the Kingdom of Wessex, which gave us a territory called Wilset or Wiltonshire, which are not perhaps the same thing. That may go back to the 8th century. Most of the present county boundary was in place before the Norman conquest. The shire was governed by a shire reeve, a sheriff, shire reeve sheriff. But by the 13th century, he was assisted in his task by members of leading local families, known as justices of the peace. And from Elizabethan times, the justices met quarterly, the quarter sessions, to dispense justice and to deal with an ever-increasing range of administrative responsibilities. In Wiltshire, there was no central headquarters. The sessions rotated around the county, meeting once a year at Salisbury, Warminster, Marlborough and Devizes, so 4 quarters. And it had no premises of its own. It met in the guild halls or market halls of each town. So that's one unit of government. The other one cropped up last night when Simon was, that wonderful talk he gave us yesterday. And that also existed before the Norman conquest. This was the hunting left there, so called because originally it was a grouping of 10 tithings, each of 10 households. And this kind of admirable decimal system had largely broken down when we first encounter it in the 11th century. But it endured, the name hundred and the boundaries of hundreds endured as a middle tier of government between shire on the one hand and parish on the other, right up until the reforms of the 1830s, which I'll come to. Well, some of these hundreds took their names from outdoor landmarks where they'd originally met. You see Swanborough Tump is a prehistoric barrow near Wilcott in Pewsey Vale, right in the middle of Wiltshire. Or going down the next one, Elstub, the elder tree stump, where they met near Enford. Or there's a standing, so over to the right again, a standing stone, the Kinwardstone near Burbage in East Wiltshire. Not very practical having a meeting out by a standing stone, and sometimes a nearby inn was actually preferred for the meeting. Well, often 100 courts were combined with those of a nearby manor and held in the manor house, and other hundreds, many of them you can see on that map, were centred on towns. So Bremhill was in Chippenham 100, and it's, I suppose, the bit, not the top, quite the top right-hand corner of Chippenham, because that includes Christian Malford, but the next bit down, adjoining Carn. Well, these arrangements, county and hundred, together with units of religion, the parish, and of ownership, the manor, went on for centuries, but change really began with the Great Reform Act of 1832 and the overhaul of the system of poor relief in 1834, which is very much Louise's territory. The latter is the more important for our purposes because it introduced a grouping of parishes. You see, the smallest unit of local government was now grouped into unions, and each union was responsible for supporting the poor by appointing a board of guardians and, in many cases, building, but certainly administering a workhouse. In Wiltshire, much of the structure of poor law unions, in the man who drew the boundaries anyway, was the wonderfully named General Charles Ashe A. Court Reppington of Heytesbury. And unlike later boundary innovators, his task was not to divide up a large unit, a county, into smaller ones, but to build up the smallest units into larger ones. So he wasn't constrained by the county boundary. Indeed, 11 of the 26 unions of parishes to which Wiltshire parishes belonged, in fact all the ones around the edge, lay in more than one county. In fact, I think the poor law reformers envisaged that in course of time the union would supplant the county as the basic unit of local government, and the county would fade into insignificance. You can see how this comes back and back over the years as to what size local authorities ought to be, a whole county, bits of counties, or much smaller units. Well, the effect of Acourt's work was to introduce a tension between county-based and union-based authorities, which wasn't fully resolved for a century, and then only by tinkering with the county boundary. The Victorians must have found this organisation into unions very useful, you see, because many of them had buildings with sort of meeting rooms, the boardroom of the guardians, and they were controlled by the local prominent local magistrates, the clergy and the aristocracy. So in 1837, when civil registration was brought in to more or less to replace parish registers, the unions became the registration districts. And later, in 1872, they became the basis of what were known as rural sanitary districts, which then turned into the RDCs, the Rural District Councils, established in 1894. And the map on the right is showing you the territories of those. This was all very sensible, except that much of the service provision was decided upon and funded on a county basis, and the unions, of course, disregarded county boundaries. We counted one of the county's divisions, the hundreds, and there was also another, petty sessions districts. You see, it gets very complicated. They all shared some boundaries and disagreed about others, so there had to be a kind of fudge. And the fudge was forced upon them in 1878 because the rural sanitary districts were made responsible for some of the highways, which was a county-based responsibility, and they took over from county-based highway districts, which were themselves based on petty sessions. You see how complicated it got. The bureaucracy involved was incredible. So as a result, some parishes were moved from one union to another, some parishes were split up, and a few, in fact, were transferred from one county to another. Right, let's apply all this to Bremhill, and then you'll see how complicated it is. Bremhill lay in Chippenham 100, and we talked about this yesterday. Simon talked about it. By the 11th century, Chippenham 100 was regarded as 142 hides, or 142 families. So you can see that by then the 10 by 10 equals 100 system had already broken down. Bremhill in Doomsday, as Simon told us yesterday, was 38 hides, 38 families, or households, or farmsteads, if you like. And if you add Cadenham, which was listed separately, which was 2 hides, on the face of it, what has become our civil parish, less Titherton Lucas, I'm afraid, may have been 40 hides altogether then, or historically 4 tithings, if we can do the maths. But for religious purposes, Bremhill Parish, which is the ancient parish, might be slightly different, including, and right up to 1952, has just been mentioned, another place some miles away, a chapelry called Highway, the other side of Hillmarton. And in fact, you can see that, I think, if you look at the left-hand map and see where Carn 100 is, there's a tiny little bit shaded just off to the top of it. And that would be Highway. So you can see, it's a few miles away, detached from Bremhill. Well, all that, I'm sure, has something to do with Malmesbury Abbey. They owned Bremhill and they owned Highway, and they just wanted to administer the two together because they were in the same general area. And we find that ecclesiastically, Foxham was also a chapelry within the parish. And from that, I guess, and Simon might want to comment, I guess that Foxham was probably one of the 4 tithings, if there were 4. You see, this is a bit that the VCH and Louise, I think we haven't quite worked it out yet, and we're going to probably come round to Simon and see what he thinks. We've got to do it anyway. Well, that system of for Bremhill of 100 and tithing and parish carries on right up to this 19th century reform in the 1830s. And then you see Bremhill was placed not in Chippenham Union, but in Carn Union. So if you look carefully at the 2 maps, what the area where Bremhill is has now switched from Chippenham. The Carn Union and RSD has carved a bit out of Chippenham, and that's Bremhill. So now that we're in Carn Poor Law Union, we then eventually get into Carn Rural District. And that's the case up until 1934. In 1934, the Carn RDC and the Chippenham RDC combine, the rural areas around the 2 towns. And so we're then in Carn and Chippenham RDC. And that goes on until 1974, when the RDC goes into North Wiltshire District Council, which in turn gets abolished when Wiltshire becomes a unitary authority and the districts disappear in the 1990s. Whew. Meanwhile, in the 1880s and 1890s, there was some of this tinkering with the parish boundary to move odd houses and little hamlets into or out of neighbouring parishes for administrative convenience. And then in 1974, I'm pretty sure it was 1974, Titherton Lucas, which had been a tithing of Chippenham, is transferred to Bremhill Parish, so comes within the ambit of Carn. You see, they're very, boundaries, they're strange things. They're inevitable and they're important, but they are rather strange. I was locked down in Yorkshire for many weeks, and taking my permitted exercise one day, I noticed that the wheelie bins on one side of a residential street had the owl insignia of Leeds, but on the other they were inscribed HBC, which stood for Harrogate Borough Council. And I figured out from this, and I think I'm right, that the town, it was Ockley in West Yorkshire, had at some date extended its urban boundary when new houses were built, but hadn't done that again when even more new houses arrived on the other side of the street, just beyond. And then in 1974, the urban area of Ockley became part of Leeds Metropolitan District in West Yorkshire. But the old RDC adjoining it was taken over by Harrogate Borough Council, which was in North Yorkshire. So now I imagine if you stand in that street, you get 2 sets of bin men in one street coming from 2 different counties and arriving from opposite directions. Such is boundaries. But you see, that's one side of boundaries. Boundaries are not just to do with local administration. If you've ever looked in a linguistic atlas, yes, they do exist, you will have encountered isoglosses, which are like isobars. They're lines drawn around areas where people use the same or different dialect words for the same thing, or they pronounce a word in a different way. That's one example. There are social boundaries too, governed by lots of things. For instance, school catchment areas. You see, in a relatively stable society, the people you made friends and enemies with at school go on to become your sort of circle of people. So you've got a kind of boundary based on your school, where you went to school. Or another thing, where your local news comes from. In Bremhill, as in Trowbridge and in Swindon, if you switch on the local news on the BBC, it comes from Bristol. So you think in terms of Greater Bristol, perhaps. If you live in Salisbury, it comes from Southampton, and you're much more attuned to Dorset and Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. And there are economic boundaries too. Just imagine, at what point along the Vale of Pewsey do you have to live to stop going to Morrison's in Devizes and start going to Waitrose in Marlborough? But that might be a cultural difference as well, of course. And has it changed over time? Well, if you look at the one on the left, I mapped where local village carriers in the 1890s, which direction they went to go to market on market day. And from that, you can build up a kind of hinterland, a catchment area around the principal towns in Wiltshire. And if you look at Chippenham and then look at Swindon, there aren't very many carriers. So it's an anomaly, actually, because you had quite a lot of railway lines by then in the 1890s, and people didn't use the carrier anymore. So there weren't any carriers. So they went to the local halt, Stanley Halt or somewhere, and went into Chippenham or went to Caen. But over much of the area, you can see how local carriers, the precursors of the local bus service and so on, were focused on a particular town, to Marlborough, to Swindon, to Warminster, to Salisbury. And then you see a social geographer in the 1940s, and this is the one on the right there. He mapped shopping areas in 1950 there, but he did lots of others. I haven't got a map of it, but he mapped such indicators as where you could get back to by the last bus after you visited the cinema. Just think about that. It's almost as important as the bicycle in the mating rituals and the consequent breeding program of post-war Wiltshire, if you think about it. That's where you pair up, the last bus home from the cinema. And I suppose some of us might even be the result of that process. There are even dietary boundaries. Thomas Hardy, in one of his short stories, has a Dorset character say, "Though I inherit the malt liquor principle from my father, I'm a cider drinker on my mother's side. She came from these parts, you know." Well, Desmond Hawkins, the Hardy scholar to whom I owe that reference, noted that while cider was often mentioned in Hardy's works, there's only a single reference to perry. Perhaps, he remarked, Hardy thought the pear suggested a more Devonian style than the apples of his native Dorset. Well, where I live, in exile in Gloucester, they say that perry pear trees only thrive if they can see May Hill, which is at the northern end of the Forest of Dean. Mind you, you can see May Hill from much of Gloucestershire, Herefordshire and parts of Worcestershire and Wales, and I can see the sunset over it from my window. So I suppose I'm a cider or perry drinker by adoption, although I will enjoy, obviously, a glass of 6X now and again when I can get it out of Wiltshire patriotism. Well, now, returning to Bremhill and to its position on Wiltshire's great north-south divide, I suppose one of the most marked differences between the two is the pattern of settlements, which in turn goes back to geology and the exploitation of the land. And we can kind of see what Aubrey was getting at. Typically on the North Wiltshire claylands, arable farming, tillage, as Aubrey termed it, had been replaced by his time, in the Tudor period, and so it was established by his time, by dairying, the milk meats he talks about. So the old open fields had been, of the arable, had been divided up and enclosed. Now, if all your land is now together in a block, instead of scattered all over the parish in the open fields, and you're going to build a new house, you build your farmhouse where your land is, with it surrounding you. And then the result is a pattern of isolated farmhouses with little or no nucleation into a recognisable village. And the manorial structure which controlled the open fields, that will have broken down too. So that the dairy farmers of North Wiltshire are likely to be their own bosses, to some extent anyway, and independently minded. And we see that in Lewis's talk, contemplative and malicious. We had several of those. That's what he said, what Aubrey said. Or we might be more charitable and say free-thinking and nonconformist. But on the chalklands of South Wiltshire, the arable farming in open fields continued well into the 19th century, and it continued, still full of big open arable fields. But in great open fields which were divided into strips, the fields belonged to and you were controlled by the lord of the manor. So there's no point having isolated farmsteads because the land you farmed lay all over the parish. So you all live together in a single nucleated village in the middle where everyone is under the thumb of the Lord. He makes you go to church and he doesn't encourage free thinking at all. Well, that's a bit oversimplified, but it does kind of make sense and it can be mapped and even seen in the landscape. This is a map drawn by a historical geographer, well, you may have come across, Corinza Lewis, she used to be on the Time team, who is, you can get your bearings, I think. This is the middle of Wiltshire, so it's not the whole of Wiltshire. But Bremhill, I suppose, is, I think it's actually, there's a little sort of daisy chain of open squares and circles about slightly above the middle and slightly to the left. You can track that down. I think that's probably Bremhill. And if you look, the individual dots are isolated farmsteads. This is in the late 18th century. The open bits, whether they be rectangles, squares, or circles, relate to sort of informal, unofficial sort of settlements, and the solid blocks relate to nucleated villages, all sort of compact together, or villages that have a sort of row, an agglomerated row, as she terms it. And if you then look at the settlement pattern, you'll see it does follow the geological map I showed you at the beginning. The isolated farmsteads tend to be in the northwest half of that map. The nucleation of villages and the agglomeration of villages is to the southwest of the line of the line that Bremhill sits on. And so if you look in more detail at the 19th century map, the top half of that is Bremhill, bits of Bremhill, and you can see there aren't any sort of substantial villages. Everyone's sort of spread out, as they still are. But if you look at a bit of Pewsey Vale, the bottom half of there, you see that everybody's living in a defined village: Patney, Churton, Marden, Wilsford, and there aren't very many odd buildings that are away from the village centres. And that, you see, is the contrast between North Wiltshire and South Wiltshire. And it's still there to some extent in the landscape. Well, at the end of the day, we draw our own boundaries based on all manner of circumstances, I suppose, and we express our allegiances in different ways. If you're abroad and talking to someone, I guess a Wiltshireman abroad will tell foreigners that they live near Bath, or in my case, I used to say near Stonehenge, because everyone in the world seems to have heard of Stonehenge. If you're in the UK, I imagine that Bremhill people tell strangers that they live in Wiltshire. If you're in Wiltshire, you would say that you live near Caen. If you're in Caen, you would say that you live in Bremhill. And if you're having a drink in the Dun Post, you'd say that you live in Foxham or Spurthill or wherever you happen to live. And you see, our territory changes for different purposes. You need a new washing machine. Well, you might go shopping in Bath or Swindon for a big purchase like that. If you're just going shopping, you probably go to the supermarket in Caen or Chippenham. Similarly, if you join a club or if you're at school. But Bremhill is your horizon for the more intimate things, well, such as history festivals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was most interesting. Really, very stimulating indeed. I'd like to open up the for questions. So if you could unshare your
map, stop the share on the map. Yes, I'll take it out of there a minute, and then I can stop share. Okay. Right,
excellent. Right. So who's got any questions or comments for John, who's defined our world so finely there?
Can I just make a comment? John, Bremhill Manor was divided up into the 4 tithings of Foxham, Bremhill, Spurt Hill, and Falkirk. But for the parish, it was, although that came a bit later, Foxham, Bremhill, Spurt Hill, and Tiverton.
Yeah. That's excellent. You see, I have in the back of my mind that one day we're going to have to draw a map for the VCH and probably for the Bremhill book, trying to define the boundaries of these 4, and we may be able to do it through existing the tithe map, and so we may be able to work it out. The VCH tries to do this, and I always have in mind the one of Urchfont in volume 10, where Douglas Crowley worked out which the different tithings were. And I expect Simon, who's somewhere lurking in the background, I think has had to do this for Oxfordshire parishes. And of course, he's an expert on these things, as you discovered last night. But that's a very good start. We've kind of got 4 tithings, and we've got a 40 hide estate. So, right, too good to be true.
the bits of the jigsaw are coming into place. Right. John Harris. If you could unmute, it would help us. John, you're on mute.
Well, he was accused of all sorts of things earlier on. He probably wasn't quiet. There you are.
I've clearly missed a lot in my life.
Yeah.
Yes. Basically referring to your village carriers map of the 1890s. I notice around Chippenham and towards Devizes, particularly in this area, there weren't many arrows at all. And of that period, I know from studying maps, a huge number of allotments around this area. Were we therefore more self-sufficient?
I don't think it's that. I think you went everywhere by train because you had more, the carriers going into Salisbury, or the villagers living on Salisbury Plain and all around, who regarded Salisbury as their town. They didn't have any railways, so they carried on using the carrier. Unfortunately, we haven't got the same data about carriers during the period before the railways. Well, they probably didn't exist in the same way before the railways. But because the Great Western Railway went between Chippenham and Swindon, and then various branches went off, I think if you wanted to go to market, we want to go to town on market day, be it Bath or Chippenham or Swindon or anywhere else, you tended to go to the nearest halt on the railway. So the map kind of breaks down. Where it works well is to see, for example, where you stop, what village you are in when you stop pointing towards Salisbury and start pointing towards Devizes or Warminster or Marlborough. It doesn't work so well in the north of the county. I think that's the answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Simon, you'd like to comment or question? Simon Draper.
It's a comment, really. Thank you very much, John. It was a comment about river catchments and how crucial river catchment areas seem to be in Wiltshire, particularly to the geography of hundreds, these Anglo-Saxon units that I talked about last night. If you look at the Domesday hundreds of Wiltshire, a lot of the boundaries closely follow the watersheds between the different valleys. And of course, you've got a whole sort of array of rivers like the Nadder and the Ebble, all feeding down to the Avon and going through Salisbury. And you, sure enough, the hundreds of Wiltshire sort of fan out in all directions from Salisbury and follow up the different river valleys. So I think that, yeah, river catchment areas and watersheds are key things about the physical geography of Wiltshire that determine administrative boundaries from the Anglo-Saxon period onwards.
That's very interesting and important, I think, because you see, I've been saying Wiltshire divides into two, but there's another school of thought which say Wiltshire divides into three, I think, because there's a point, I think it's somewhere between Bishop's Cannings and Avebury, where, you know, the rain falling on one side of you goes into the Thames, on another side it goes into the English Channel, on another side it goes into Bristol Channel. So you have actually got a tripartite division based on the drainage systems, haven't you? You're either going into the Kennet and Thames one way, you're going into the Salisbury rivers on the one, or you're going to the Bristol Avon on the other side, and that, as you say, tallies quite well with the 100 boundaries, doesn't it?
Yes, and there's a further point, which is that the chalk escarpment, the boundary between the chalk and the cheese in Wiltshire, is exactly the point where sort of early Anglo-Saxon England from the south and the east met post-Roman British Celtic Britannia. So the boundary through Wiltshire, the chalk cheese divide, was the frontier of it was the western frontier of Anglo-Saxon England for a good 2 centuries, from about 400 to 600, and it was only around 650 that they sort of thought about moving further north to around Malmesbury and towards Somerset. And so the physical divide between the chalk and the cheese was key to determining the boundary of Anglo-Saxon England. So
Great. Yeah.
Right.
Which, I mean, I hinted at the difference between Wilset and Wiltonskire, and whether they're actually the same thing, whether they include North Wiltshire or not, you know.
Yeah, I think they were different.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Okay, I think, well, in that case, it just remains to me to say thank you to all our speakers. We've been treated to some fascinating talks, and also some other thanks as well to James and Chris from the VCH, and particularly to John, Helen, Sarah and Craig, who've worked very hard to progress the project and to produce the history trail, which some of you have been able to go on today, and the app which and website which Craig has been leading on. I think we're very proud of what we've got there, and it'll be the basis for something we can really build on to hopefully extend to every house in the parish in due course. Thank you to all of you for participating and for the very appreciative feedback which we've received. It's very encouraging. Please keep involved. Although this weekend isn't quite what we'd originally planned, I hope you've all found it enjoyable and informative, and maybe even comforting in these very uncertain times. Thank you all very much.